Okay, welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur. So this week's Parsha is Parsha Shemini, and what I've got here, it's pretty much will take up the whole of the Shiur. I've got a second idea, just a little thing at the end, but it's really the story of Nadav and Avihu. It's a well-known story, but I've always wanted to go through this properly in Shiur, and we're not even going to go through it properly. I've taken out the key points of the Michtav Melio. But we'll explore it and we'll see a very interesting essay from Rav Dessler. The Parsha begins, Vayi Bayom HaShemini, and the opening episode really talks about the death of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron HaKohen. And the difficulty is that Chazal give a lot of different reasons why they actually died. And the Michtav Melio lists them. And he lists 15 different reasons that the Gemara and the Midrashim say. And what he'll do is he'll find one central theme, one root cause. And it's a fascinating piece in the Michtav Melio. So let's explore it together. So if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. So the first box, let's just start from the Psukim. So Vayikra Perek Yud, Pasuk Aleph. Vayikchu bnei Aaron Nadav Avihu Ish machtosoi vayitnu bohen eish. So the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, take their fire pan and they put fire on it, vayasimu leh katoires, and they put the incense, vayakrivu lifnei Hashem eish zara, and they offer up this strange fire, this eish zara, asher lo tzivah esom, which they were not commanded to do. So that's what the pasuk describes. Vateitze eish lifnei Hashem, and fire comes out, vatoichal esom, and fire consumes them, and Nadav and Avihu die. Moshe says to Aaron, that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told me. Through my close ones, I will become sanctified. And Aaron famously responds with silence. Vayidom Aaron. The Chofetz Chaim says, why Vayidom? There are many other words to describe silence. Vayecherash, Vayishkait. Vayidom is related to the word doimim. Doimim means an inanimate object. So Vayidom Aaron suggests that he was like an inanimate object. He was expressionless. He didn't have a grimace on his face. So Vayidom Aaron, he was totally silent and didn't display the upset and the anger. He was so in control of his emotions. Next pasuk, Vayikra Moshe al Mishael v'leil Tzofim b'nei Uziel doid Aaron. Aaron HaKohen asks these two people, they're his uncles, his cousins, and they'll deal with the kvura of Nadav and Avihu. Now, says the Michtav Melio, this is in Chelik Beis on page 244. Kol Divrei Torah, says Rav Dessler, Hein shebichsav, hein shebal peh. All aspects of Torah, whether it's Torah shebichsav, whether it's Torah shebal peh, Nemru betachlis ha'emes hamuduyekes ve'ein bohem melitzes haloshen shelo tisamena b'diuk l'metzias. It's all accurate. Every single word is conveying an important point. There's no hyperbole. There's no sort of exaggeration. Omru chazal b'misbnei Aaron b'krevei HaKodesh. And about the death of Nadav and Avihu, the Torah describes it as b'krevei HaKodesh. Through my close ones, I will become sanctified. Omar Moshe Aaron, Achi. Now this is what Rashi brings on this pasuk. Moshe said to Aaron, Achi, my dear brother, I knew that on the day of the Chanukas HaMishkan, the house, the Mishkan in other words, is going to be sanctified through those who are close, who know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Who are the greatest in the generation? It's me or you. So I knew that either you or I were going to sort of not survive the Chanukas HaMishkan. And now I know that they, Nadav and Avihu, are greater than you and I. That's what Rashi brings on this pasuk. Says the Michtav Melio, Lo b'mdimyonos nichim es Aaron. He wasn't comforting Aaron with hot air, with the illusions. Elemetzias mamashi. He was being real. Heim gedolim mimeni umimeka. Nadav and Avihu were greater than Moshe and Aaron. That means it was true. They were greater than Moshe and Aaron. Next paragraph. and you want to be even more to be amazed at the greatness of their righteousness, take a look. He says, "Ayin Zohar Achrimos." Take a look in the Zohar in Achrimos, and this is what it says: "B'chol zimna de tzadikaya mistalke me'alma." Every time a tzaddik takes leave of this world, dina istalik me'alma. Some harsh judgment also leaves the world. And the death of tzaddikim atones for the liabilities of the generation. And this parsha of talking about the sons of Aaron, we lay it on Yom Kippur, and we have a kapara lecheved Israel, that it should be a kapara for all the liabilities of Klal Yisrael. Nodav aviu bil chudai shekulin have lekabel shivin in Sanhedrin dav meshamshin k'mei Moshe or begin kach misasim mechapar Yisrael, because they're equal to the whole of the Sanhedrin. To have a trailer shtakchu kvasai Yisrael, but you don't find two like this in the whole of Klal Yisrael. So clearly, the Zohar is talking in very very generous terms about Nodav and Avihu. We lay in the parsha of Nodav and Avihu on Yom Kippur as a kapara. Not just then, but now. You don't find two people like that in the whole of Klal Yisrael. Says the Michtav Menyo, Bi'aru lanu shemises Nodav Avihu lo rak shekipra adoram. Not only did it mechaper, did it atone for them in their generation, ela she'ad hayoy mechaperes yal Klal Yisrael b'chol dar v'dar. That in every generation, the death of Nodav and Avihu, which we read on Yom Kippur, is an atonement. Zeh kama alof mshana. This is going back 3,300 plus years. It should be a kapara so many centuries later. And yet, nevertheless, and despite the greatness which we've just described, Chazal have listed many criticisms, many chatoim that they committed. So how do we square that? How do we square the fact that Chazal listed many indictments against them, and yet they were considered gedolim in Moshe Aaron? They were even greater than Moshe Aaron. And their zechus is so great. If their zechus indeed is so great, how did they sin? How could they slip up on these things? This wonder requires some sort of explanation. Now, what he then does, the Michtav Menyo, is he tells us what Chazal tell us that they did wrong. And he goes through and he collects from Midrashim, the Medrash Tanchuma, the Medrash Rabbi, all the various things that Chazal lists. Now, I've listed them here. Aleph, let's go through them. Shehoiru halacha b'fnei Rabban. The first thing they did, say Chazal, is that they paskened in front of their Rabbonim, i.e. Moshe and Aaron. Base. Al hakriva shenichnasu lifnai v'lifnim. They went inside to the Kodesh Kedoshim in the Mishkan. Gimel. Al hakrava shehekrivu karban shenistavu. They offered up a carbon which they were not commanded to do. Daled. Al eish zara, of this strange fire. What does that mean? Eish mibeis kiraim hichnisu. They should have just brought eish from the Mizbeach, but instead they brought eish from their own ovens in their own homes. Hey, Ya'an shelo notlu eitzah zeh mizeh. Nodav and Avihu didn't consult each other. Vov, al shahu shasuya yayin. Another Chazal tells us that they drank wine. They were intoxicated when they came inside. Zayin, al shahu mechusrei begadim. Another indictment is that they were lacking the begadim that they should have worn. What was that? Umayu chaserin me'il. They weren't wearing the me'il, which we'll explain soon, because they were not Kohanim Gedolim. The me'il is specifically the Kohen Gadol. We'll talk about that. Ches al shenichnasu b'lo rechitzis yadayim v'raglayim. They went into the Mishkan without doing rechitza, washing their hands and feet from the kiyah as they're meant to do. Tes al shelo hoyu lohem bonim. They didn't have children. They haven't been mekayim the mitzvah of Puravu. Yud al shelo hoyu lohem noshim. They didn't get married. They didn't have wives. Omru, they said, Achi Avinu Melech. Our father's brother is Melech, Moshe Rabbeinu. Avinu Kohen Gadol. Our father is the Kohen Gadol. Anu Skane Kahuna. We are the Skan Kohanim. So we are very miyuchas. Our father's brother is the king. Our father is the Kohen Gadol. We're the Skan Kohanim. Eize Isha Higenes Lanu. Who are we going to find who's a suitable match for us? Yud Aleph, the 11th indictment that they did. Moshe Aaron Holchin Techila, when Moshe and Aaron were walking at the front of the procession, Nadav Avihu Mahalchim Achareihem, and Nadav and Avihu were walking behind them, and they said, Mosai Shnei Zakenim Halalu Mesim. When are these two elders going to die? And we can take charge. And that's how the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings it in Daf Nun Beis. And then it adds on, Rabbi Yudin b'Shem Rabbi Omar b'fneihem omru ze lo ze. They said that in front of them, so they heard it. And Rabbi Pinchas Omer b'libam hirharu. So they only thought it. Okay, that's 11. Yud Beis vayechezu es elikim vayechlu vayishtu. They sort of they saw Hashem, and yet they ate and they drank. Gisu libon v'zonu eineim and ashchina. They were sort of had a certain arrogance that they feasted their eyes on the Shechina. Yud Gimel. Inyan Eish Zara, Ramas Ramban, the Ramban hints in Parsha Shemini, the Dvar of Sesumin, but his words are quite cryptic. Ubiram Rikanti Ein Sham, and the Rikanti elaborates on the words of the Ramban. The Teichen Ho'inyan, and says the Desla, the essence of what he says is this: Shahoylahem Lechav Neshem HaMyuchot. They should have somehow been mechaven, intended to use the Midas HaRachamim. The Shem HaMyuchot, he says, is the Midas HaRachamim. V'heim kivnu le-Midas Hadin, but rather they intended to focus on Midas Hadin. V'hainu Eish Zara, that's Pshat Eish Zara. What does that mean? Eish is Midas Hadin, is the strict judgment. Tachas Ishe L'Reich Nechoyach, which is Midas HaRachamim. They should have instead used an Ishe Reich Nechoyach, which is Midas HaRachamim. V'alkein kosu v'yasimo leha al ha'eish, b'china Midas Hadin, v'loi alehen al ha'machtois. Again, it's alluded to the fact that they were mechaven to din and not to rachamim. Because they thought they were on such a high level, they didn't need midas harachamim. Below siyur rachamim, they could sort of, get by midas hadin because there was no lack. And then Yudalad Yud brings two others. The point is, you'll see over Shabbos and you'll read, whenever you explore Parsha Shemini, people will get to give different reasons. But it's nice to see the Michtav Menyo lists all 15 reasons that Chazal bring in various places as to what they did wrong. Now, what he then does, and again, I've taken out the key parts, but what Rav Dessler then does is find a common denominator between all 15 of the reasons. So if you look at the top of the next page, there is one root source for all of the sins. Chazal lists many various indictments. Klal Godlu. There is a general rule. When Chazal give different opinions in Agadata, they're all true. They're just shedding different light from different angles on this picture. So all 15 are somehow true. And when you explore and delve into these 15 reasons, it turns out, it appears, there is one root cause. Commensurate to their very lofty level, they were lacking a degree of humility. And that lack was because of their very lofty level. They relied on their very lofty level. That emerges from the Ramban and the Zohar and other sources. Haramban Bia, next paragraph. Haramban Bia. They intended with their carbon to align themselves to Midas Hadin. V'lo to Midas Harachamim, and not to sort of invoke Midas Harachamim. V'nevayat Dvar, let's explain their words. V'haChavetz Chaim Heir b'Biur Teres Kahanim Shom. That the Chavetz Chaim elaborates on this in his Pirush in the Teres Kahanim. Ki ulai meisu Moshe v'Aaron b'chayehem, because had Moshe and Aaron died, they would have been valid next generation leaders of the Jewish people. Daradea, this unbelievable generation, the Daradea. That's what it says. When they anointed Elazar v'Isamar, it's it follows the beginning of the pasuk, which says "Vayomas Nodav Avihu," which suggests she'im hayu Nodav Avihu b'chaim, had Nodav and Avihu been alive, ha'isa shayeches lehem gedula, they would have been the leaders. So it's true. They thought because they were on such a high level, they didn't need midas harachamim. And they weren't scared of any flaw. And they thought they could get by with their standard alone. It's midas hadin. We need rachamim. It's impossible to live with midas hadin. Midas hadin is strict judgment. You put one foot wrong, you're out. There's no room for. There's no wiggle room. The way Rabbi always gives the mashal, that if you're sitting at a table, you're a guest at somebody's home, and imagine your host is sitting over there and your hostess is sitting over there, and you're in the middle, and let's say the hostess says to you, "Excuse me, can you pass the salt?" And you look at her and say, "Excuse me, I'm eating. Can you leave me alone?" And she looks at her husband a bit strange. And then he says to the guest, "Can you pass the Coke, please?" And he says, "Look, I'm not passing the salt, I'm not passing the Coke, just leave me alone." The likelihood that guy will never be invited back. An unusual guest. 1 foot out, you're wrong, you're off. Well, midas hadin, that's what midas hadin dictates. Midas harachamim means there's flexibility, there's room for leniency, that's what it is. Why is the rainbow a sign of midas hadin? When rain comes, seen through the prism, if the sun shines, when do you have a rainbow? When it's raining and at the same time there's sunshine. What does the sun do? It takes that little raindrop and it breaks it down into various colors, into its seven, Roy Gabiv, right? The different colors. Midas hadin puts you under the spotlight. And not many people can withstand the scrutiny of being under the spotlight. That's what it does. And therefore, they thought that there was no chisaron. We can cope with this lofty level of midas hadin. But they needed rachamim. And the truth is, there's precedent for that. If you look at the end of the last paragraph in that box B, that was Yaakov Vinu's tefillah as well. Like it says in the pasuk, "V'hoya Hashem lila lekim." V'hoya Hashem is midas harachamim, lila lekim midas hadin. I.e., that Yaakov Avinu also wanted to live on that very lofty level of midas hadin. And they acted on it. Nodav and Avihu thought they were on that level. And the truth is, they were not wrong. They sort of preempted it. They were a little bit they weren't ready for it fully. And because there was a little bit of a chisaron, there was a little flaw, then that manifested itself in lots of different ways. Now, if that's the case, if the root problem is anova, we can now go through the 15 and we can see their problem. We can see the issues. Let's go through. Number 1, sheharu halach b'fnei rabban. Well, if you're lacking a little bit of anova, then you're going to paskin in front of someone who's greater than you. You won't hold back. Al hakriva shenichnasu lifnai v'lifnim. You feel comfortable. If you're lacking if you have anova, you're a little bit more reluctant to go lifnai v'lifnim. You're not going to push yourself forward so quickly. Gimel, al hakrova shekrivu carbon shelistavu. They offered up something they weren't commanded. That's a degree of arrogance. Again, lefi madrigoso.
I don't quite understand. Is it that they elected to go for midas hadin and not have? I must have missed the connection.
The point is, the root error was that they were lacking a little bit of anova. They were on a very lofty level. They thought they can aspire and live by midas hadin, which is like living on the fast lane. But if you're living on the fast lane, there's no room for error. And they didn't appreciate that they weren't quite ready for it yet. They were lacking a little bit of anova, and therefore they weren't ready for midas hadin.
We don't get to choose what.
Yaakov Avinu was on such a level that he said, "V'hoili lelekim," that I want to live on this level of midas hadin. And he could do it. But the Nodav and Avihu, they chose to live on that level because they overestimated because there was only a tiny trace of anova that was lacking. A tiny trace of gaiva that was there. And therefore, but the point is that they weren't ready, they were sort of preempted it, and therefore they slipped. But the interesting thing is, when you have a root problem, let's say of Anova, it will manifest itself in all different ways. So you go through what Chazal say, the root problem in every single one is a lack of Anova. So for example, al Eish Zora, Eish Mibeis Kirayim Hichnisu. Again, if you have a certain yira, a certain respect, you're not going to bring fire from your own oven. They didn't consult each other. You only consult each other when when there is a degree of anivas. Rabbi Twersky I once read something from him that he once, when he was an intern or a very junior doctor studying psychiatry, he gets a call from the great professor, and he said, "I understand you've got experience in this particular area. I'd like to ask your advice." And he thought, "Wow, little me, the great professor's asking me." It's easy to ask someone who's way junior than you. That is already a level. But it's easier to ask someone who's a lot junior to you. But to ask someone on your level, you need an even higher degree of anova. And though not be'etzazem mizeh. Now, Vov Shesuya Yayin. Now, if you turn back to the paragraph C on the second page, Adayin lo ne'asar. Shesuya Yayin was not yet prohibited, because it's only later in the Parsha there's the whole Parsha of Shesuya Yayin. So va'afa pikein, but still, says the Michtav Milyo, ilu hishtamshu b'yira, had they had the requisite degree of yira, hayu nimnoim milikonis afilu achar vis yain, they would have known that it's not appropriate to drink. There's a certain sensitivity. There's to the makom, to the place. You don't drink before you go there. Zayin, mechusre begodim, and this is very interesting. Chisoran ha-me'il, why dafka the me'il? Shenem boy, because it says about the me'il, v'hoyal aron asharis v'nishma koilei, she'pa'amoini ha-me'il boim laharchik es midas hadin. The whole purpose of the me'il, it has bells on it, it's to be marchik midas hadin, pirush, she'kol ha-pa'amonim yu'eres ha-koyin ha-godel yira pnimis. It's to encourage a person to have yira. Remember where you're going. You are walking in the Beis Hamikdash. This is a spiritually radioactive place. Sheloi titein achiza lemidas hadin, that midas hadin shouldn't grasp onto them. That's what the bells on the me'il are meant to forewarn. Hainu im gam shahayu kohanim hedjot she'im lo sheme'il. Like we said before, true they were kohanim hedjotos, they were not kohanim gedolim. Bram hoisa chasera lohem bekonsom lehagdir akteres oisa yer primishim eseres aladem il. The point is that they were lacking the item that the me'il was going to prevent. In other words, the me'il is meant to warn a person. Remember, you are in the Beis Hamikdash. There's yira. This is radioactive. You've got to be very careful. The lack of the me'il, even though they couldn't wear the me'il, represents the fact that they were too blasé about walking around the Beis Hamikdash. And then lastly, chisaron. Sorry, they weren't allowed to wear it. But when it says they were mechusa begodim, it means that they were lacking the function of the me'il. In other words, you're right, they're kohanim hedjotos, they're not going to wear the me'il. But the fact they could walk around with a certain I wouldn't say blasé, that's a bit too heavy, but they were with a certain confidence, with a lack of trepidation of walking in this holy place, shows that they were missing the lesson of the me'il. That's what it means. What is the me'il there? It has pamonim to remind you trepidation, walk carefully. And therefore that's what it means on mechuzim. Not they actually didn't have them, because they weren't meant to wear them. And then of course chisrei bonim and chisrei noshim, well that's clear that you go through the others, they were who's worthy to marry us. That also is a degree of gaiva. They're lacking a little bit of anova. And bottom as well, he explains. Okay, but what's fascinating, we have to press on, but what's fascinating is that midas are so, we have to be so self-aware. When there's one little pagam, there's one little lack, it can manifest itself in 1,000 different ways. And a person has to be very self-aware about his own midas, that he's got to walk with care, because a lack of anova could manifest itself in, like he says, in these 15 different ways. A person has any other root problem, whatever it may be. That's why midas is everything. It's the foundations of everything, and a lack is going to cause chaos all over the place. Okay, so either way, we'll finish off just one other idea, but just concerning this idea of Nadav and Avihu, I think it's fascinating that A, he takes together these 15 different ideas, he collates them, which itself is fascinating, and B, he comes back to the problem. Chazal speak in the highest of praise of Nadav and Avihu. They clearly are like Moshe and Aaron, that Mimeni Gedolim, Mimeni Omeka. We lay in the Parsha of Nadav and Avihu on Yom Kippur in order to be mechaper. And they were mechaper not just on that generation, but on every generation. That's why we lay in it on Yom Kippur afternoon. And so how can we square that? The answer is, of course, they were very, very great. But one tiny error is going, and they were not holding by living on Mitzadin, and they needed Rachamim, but because they sort of overestimated their own status, that lack of Anova manifested itself in all these different areas. So a very, very interesting essay of Rav Dessler regarding the death of Nadav and Avihu. Let me just finish with one idea related to the rest of the Parsha. The rest of the Parsha largely deals with kashrus, all the various kosher and non-kosher animals. And there is a very, very famous idea regarding the chasidah. The chasidah is the stalk. And it's quoted always in the name of the Chidush Arim. So I thought I got the Chidush Arim al Torah, and I thought we'd just go through this little piece, and I'll share with you a fabulous story that relates to it. The Chidush Arim says the following. If you look at the last box, paragraph 2. Pirish Rashi. V'loma nikrishma chasida. Why is the stalk, why is the chasida called the chasida? She'eise chasidus im chavruseha b'mzoinus. That this stalk is a very kind animal. It does chesed with its friends with food. It helps out and gives food to its friends. Says the Chidush Arim v'kasha. If that's the case, there's a problem. Lama hi nechsheves ka'if tameh. If the chasidah, the stalk, is so kind, why is it therefore considered a non-kosher animal? Because it does chesed with its friends. The Ramban famously says, how do we know which animals are kosher and not kosher? So the Ramban says, because the oifas tameim, the non-kosher birds, have a streak of cruelty. So where does the chasidah fit in? The chasidah is a very kind animal. Its name denotes its kindness. The chasidah, it does chesed in chavruseha. So why therefore shouldn't it be kosher? That's the famous kasha. Says the Chidush Arim, penultimate sentence, last sentence. Upirshu, and the explanation is this. Ya'an shi oise chesed rak im chavruseha. The reason is because it only does chesed with its kind. Umi she'ena me chavruseha einhi oizeres. But anyone who's not in that circle won't bother. He won't give any help. Afilu b'ma'at, even a little bit, even with a little bit of food. And because of that, because the chesed is limited to its chavrusel, to its own kind, its own circle, and not beyond, therefore it fits in very squarely with the Ramban's definition. That's called achzarias. So I tell you a fabulous story I just came across. That Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, the great Rosh Hashiva of Torah Vodas, in America, he died in 1986. One of the beloved Torah personalities of the last century. So in 1955, the Pesach Chron tells this story, he was called to adjudicate over a din Torah in some out-of-town place. And he, although of course he spoke English, he felt that he needed a translator, someone who could speak properly so he could fully understand what the two sides were saying. So he called one of his Talmidim, and Rabbi Weisberger, who then worked for Torah Masorah. And he said, listen, I've got this din Torah, I've got to leave early on Sunday morning. Would you be willing to come with me to help me to translate? So this guy, to spend some time with his Rebbe, his Rosh Hashiva, he would be delighted. Yeah, with pleasure, of course. So the Rosh Hashiva said, good, I had anticipated that, I've already bought you the ticket. Fine, let's meet at Penn Station, the big station in America, 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Motzei Shabbos, Rabbi Yaakov calls this fellow and says, I've just remembered, you're in Shana Rishona, right? He said, yeah. So he said, listen, it's not straightforward that you can be away from your wife for a day or two, however long they're going to be away. Maybe she should come with. And whilst we're involved in the din Torah, I'll get someone there to show her the city or to stay with her. Okay, I'll check with my wife. She comes like, yeah, she'd be delighted to come. Rabbi Yaakov says, great, I anticipated that, I've got a ticket for her. And they meet the next morning at Penn Station at 7 o'clock. He says afterwards, this Weisberger, that he had bought the ticket because if they'd waited to get to buy the ticket at the station, then he would have insisted on paying, and he didn't want this young man to pay, so he bought the ticket beforehand. Fine. He gets to the station at 7 o'clock on Sunday morning at Penn Station, and Rabbi Yaakov, who was a very sort of upbeat, positive person, looked haggard and exhausted. So his Talmud said to him, Shiur, you look very tired, is everything okay? So he said, look, I'll tell you what happened last night. He said it was very, very hot. There was no air conditioning in those days, or very little. I had to sleep with the window open. And because we were meeting at Penn Station at 7 in the morning, I had a certain Seder, I needed to get up very early, I had to set my alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning. I know my neighbor, a non-Jewish, a very fine non-Jewish person, is a very light sleeper. If I set my alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning, it will wake me up, and it will wake him up as well. I couldn't do that to him. So I stayed up last night, I learned, I prepared my shiurim, and that's why I'm very tired. Now that's godless. Sensitivity is not just to your wife, and not just to your immediate circle, but even to the non-Jewish neighbor next door. I'm sensitive to his lack of sleep. He says Sunday morning is the one day he gets to sleep in, and I should deprive him of that. Can you imagine? You can stay up all night to display that sensitivity to a non-Jewish neighbor. Remarkable. And that's really the vart of the Chasidah. So why is it called the Chasidah? Because it does Chasidus in Chavru Sehel. But it's limited to that circle. Anyone beyond that circle, it doesn't do it. And therefore, that's Achzorius. That's why the Ramban, and it fits in very, very squarely to what the Ramban says, that the Oifes Tameim, the non-kosher birds, have a streak of Achzorius, and the stork, the Chasidah, therefore fits under that category.